Hello and welcome to World Talks, where every word matters. I'm your host, Sasha Farbach. Now, Russia shot down our airliner and has to apologize. Those are the words of Azerbaijani President Aliyev, who did not beat around the bush when it comes to the recent tragedy that killed 38 and left many more injured as a passenger plane crashed in Kazakhstan at what most agree was an accidental blast from Russian air defense over Grozny. Aliyev has also demanded compensation and rejected Putin's proposal to have the accident examined by a Moscow-led group of aviation experts. But beyond the single matter of liability and justice, broader questions remain. Can the tragedy push Azerbaijan away from Moscow, undermining the regional partnership of convenience? In order for us to talk more about it, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Bauyrzhan Zhanuzakov, an international relations lecturer from Łazarski University. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you for having me.
So these expectations that the president of Azerbaijan has leveled, Russia must apologize, second, it must admit guilt, third, punish the guilty, bring them to criminal responsibility, pay compensation.
Right.
What we know right now, the Baku side, satisfied or not?
Well, let me start from the fact that after the crash has happened, it's worth mentioning that, there were media outlets that have been trying to disseminate the version that the plane crashed because of the, clash with the pack of birds, or maybe the explosion of oxygen balloon on the plane. And these versions, investigation into these versions, trying to see where they actually lead us to the Moscow-backed media outlets, and they are not in the air anymore. And probably because they have clashed at the wall of undeniable evidence that we have at the moment. And they will all have been clearly reflected in the speech that President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has given yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. And you're right. This is a very assertive stance that Azerbaijan is exposing, and the requirements that Ilham Aliyev has stated, the punishment of the guilty, the apology for the tragic accident, responsibility taking, and the last one is a payment of compensation to the families that have become victims of the tragic accident. They are all reflecting Azerbaijan's firm stance to Russia, and probably also an opportunity to somehow drift away from Moscow further.
Yeah. And I think that this is the drift I want to talk about, because right now, this has been a relationship of convenience for Azerbaijan and Russia for some time. It's also, I think, matters here, right? It's about the whole region, the South Caucasus as a whole. So what happens next if, let's say, these areas are not going to get what they want here, and very likely the Kremlin, not known for admitting to its mistakes, what does that do to relationships between the Azeris and the Russians, and potentially also other players around the region?
Well, what do we have now? We know that Russian side satisfied one of these requirements. It's an apology, but then it was quite an elusive apology. The apology was that, Kremlin, Moscow, there was a phone call conversation, and according to the summaries of these phone call conversations, Putin has apologized for the fact that tragic accident happened in the airspace of Russian Federation. And what remains to be waited for is the deciphering of the black boxes, which probably is going to be the most solid evidence for this whole mystery, this whole story. And then apparently at the moment, Russia is back to the wall and doesn't have any way out of this situation. So we'll have to, as much as it is artful in propaganda machine and coming up with framing versions of its own, it'll have to be very, very careful. And I think the margin for them is very narrow.
Mm-hmm. We know that the Russians operate very much on this propaganda with disinformation, misinformation, but it has its limits, I think. And now we have a whole country in Azerbaijan who've now buried these pilots, who've seen them as heroes. So I think there's something that needs to happen. I'm curious also by the idea now with Kazakhstan. That's where the plane crash is. That's where the plane remains are. What about the investigation, let's say, bias or non-bias also of Kazakhstan. And we know that President Tokayev owes very much his power to President Putin back in 2022 in that intervention of Russia. How objective is he going to be in this investigation?
Well, this is one of the points of concern, areas of concern that most of the political analysts are pointing to. In fact, Russia has suggested that the investigation would be done within the framework of the Interstate Airspace Committee, which is mostly dominated by Russian delegation. Right? Although all three countries involved here are parts of this committee, Azerbaijan has refused it, and for clear reasons. It wants the investigation to be transparent, and it wants the investigation to be as free as possible of Moscow's influence. At the moment, the investigation committee is led by Kazakhstan. The delegation, is represented by members of Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and of course there is this team from Brazil, Brasilia, which is the country producer of the flight.
The Amber.
Yeah, of course. And it's a good thing that Kazakhstan has sent the black boxes to be deciphered by the CENIPA, the investigative body from Brasilia.
Mm-hmm. So we're looking at more of an international, let's say, investigation into this. But at the end, when we've had these instances with Russia, as you said, they don't necessarily step forward and admit that guilt or that fault. But also looking at the relationship also with Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. Tell us more about this kind of cooperation between these two countries because of this incident.
President Ilham Aliyev has stated that he had a phone call with President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, where they have exchanged condolences over the tragic situation where citizens of both countries were involved. And President Ilham Aliyev also expressed gratefulness for the help that and the reaction of the Kazakhstan side was. All these attempts by the governmental institutions and generally by public, there was no lack of volunteers to donate blood and just expose any form of other forms of support. I think this is also kind of an opportunity, a challenge that exposes certain opportunities for the two countries to grow their ties further. But then whether this opportunity will be implemented and whether it won't be, let's say, it won't be impacted by the leverages, political leverages from Moscow, is to be seen.
Mm-hmm. We've also seen with Kazakhstan actually growing much closer with Russia in terms of trade ever since that intervention back in 2022, but also very much the uncertainty right in that region. So what happens if the Russians don't abide by President Aliyev's demands here in the latter with compensation, with an admission of guilt? Who steps in here? Do the Azeris now turn more against Russia and other factors? Is this going to impact relations? Are they going to turn to Turkey? Are they going to turn somewhere else? What does the geopolitics here impact this?
Well, you're right. It's definitely going to be a ground to drift further away from Moscow for Azerbaijan. There have been also certain concerns by some political analysts regarding whether this story could turn into a ground for behind the curtains political concessions, bargains by countries involved. And what I so far hope that the assertiveness that Azerbaijan has been exposing in the in form of president's speech is going to be the stance that they will keep further.
Yeah, okay. And also now looking at the investigation, I mean, what's next at this point as well? We're waiting for the timeline of this international investigation. Do we have that conclusive any time in the next few weeks, months? How long could we wait for potential final evidence or what happened on that fateful day?
Well, I don't think that there is a clear-cut timeline from what I have been reading up on this whole story is that, the limits could be from 10 days and up without any limits in terms of the length. So we'll see.
There's an interesting also incident that happened back in 2020, on November 9th, 2020, where actually a Russian helicopter didn't identify itself in Nagorno-Karabakh, was shot down by the Azerbaijani forces. The Russians immediately demanded a compensation, an apology, and admission of guilt. Just from that example, do you think that's going to be used as leverage by Baku to get the same now for Moscow?
It has to be. It has to be. I mean, situation is quite a tantamount. It's quite parallel to the story that I have described just a second ago. And I think it should be an example that Kremlin requires other countries to behave. It should be the same pattern of behavior for Kremlin. But well, whether Kremlin will be behaving in that pattern, that remains to be seen.
Yeah.
It's a big question.
And I mean, clearly here, this is. If it's going to be confirmed, one of the theories is air defense systems that were activated in Grozny. This is something that also the Ukrainians have been trying, right, with electronic warfare, with their drone attacks. Does this bring the conflict in Ukraine closer to the realities of Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan? Does this bring it now closer?
Of course. Well, as I have been saying a couple of days ago here, these are the first civilian victims, citizens of Kazakhstan, who passed away as a result of this conflict or escalation of the conflict that has been unleashed by Russian aggression in Ukraine. So that also gives Kazakhstan to some kind of legitimate ground to be assertive in the demands to demystify this whole story, see what were the reasons of the plane's crash, and demand the truth for the families of those who have, well, lost their close ones.
So I think in the end here we have a tragedy, but it could very much, it's wrapped in geopolitics and could very much still, I think, continue to prove some interesting developments here. So we'll have to see how it all develops with the investigation as the information we have it. But certainly it has many concerns, as we said, the innocent loss of life, but also the heroic efforts of those pilots from Azerbaijan. Right. Look, well, thank you so much for coming in. Was my guest here, Bauyrzhan Zhanuzakov. Thank you so much for all that.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us here on World Talks. That concludes this edition. My name is Sasha Farbach. Goodbye.